Hey, my name is Milan, and this might just be one of the most important videos that I have made on this channel so far. I'm going to introduce you to a relatively new coding IDE called Cursor, and what makes Cursor unique is its integration with generative AI that's going to help you write code faster. You're going to see how we will use it to build a small but completely functional application by the end of this video. So what is Cursor and why am I so excited to make this video? Cursor is an AI code editor that helps you write code insanely fast using generative AI. And if you take a look at the IDE here, it might remind you of Visual Studio Code. And that's because Cursor is a fork of VS Code with additional capabilities that allow us to use artificial intelligence. Now, you might be wondering how much does something like this cost? So let's go to pricing, and you will see that they have a free plan. And I've been using this for the past few days, playing around, building a few applications, and I can tell you that even the free plan is insanely powerful. Now, if you really want to use this in your day-to-day, I definitely recommend that you purchase the Pro plan, and you'll be able to use Cursor without much worry. Now, let's open up the Cursor IDE, and let me show you what that looks like. So we're now in the Cursor IDE, and to me, it pretty much looks identical to VS Code, with the addition of a chat panel here that you can use to interact with the artificial intelligence that's going to help us write the code. Now, what I have here is a URL shortener user interface application, and right now I just have an empty JavaScript file and an index.html with hello world inside. So this is going to be our starting point, and we're going to use Cursor to write all of the code. And you'll be amazed at how nice the code looks like that Cursor produces, and also what the development experience looks like, which makes Cursor pretty unique. But before we dive into writing our user interface, let me just walk you through the backend application that we're going to use, because we are actually going to build a fully functional URL shortener. So this is my backend application. It's a .NET 8 API. It's using EF Core to connect with a SQL Server database, and it has 4 minimal API endpoints that comprise the main functionality. We have the shorten endpoint that allows us to specify a request containing a long URL, and we are going to attempt to shorten this URL using our custom logic for shortening long URLs, and then we're just going to store that in the database and return the short URL as the response. Now, the logic that you can see here is going to attempt to shorten a URL for a maximum number of attempts, which I hard-coded to 3. And we're going to start by creating a random short code that's going to actually represent the shortened URL. You will see how this works in just a moment. And then we're going to use the link generator service that we have in ASP.NET Core to generate a fully functional URI that contains this shortened URL, and we're targeting the redirect endpoint. I will show you what it looks like right after I show you the rest of the code here. Then we're just going to create our shortened URL record and attempt to store that in the database using EF Core. Now, if this fails, it means that we probably ran into a conflict. We're going to log this warning and the exception and try again. And if we end up failing 3 times, we can return null and return a bad request from the endpoint, or otherwise we could throw an exception and return some other response. It doesn't really matter. I just don't want to continue shortening the URL indefinitely. Now let's take a look at the redirect endpoint. And here we're just specifying the shortened code that we can use to retrieve the shortened URL from the database. And then if it's not found, we're going to return a 404 not found response. Otherwise, we're going to redirect the user to the long URL that is associated with this unique code. The redirect result is going to return a 302 found response, which is going to allow us to hit this endpoint multiple times. But if you want this to be a permanent redirect, you can set the permanent flag to true, and then it's going to return a 301 move permanently, and this is going to tell the browser to cache the result of the redirect. So we're not going to be hitting the backend multiple times. Now, something else I have in this endpoint that's also interesting is route constraints, where I have a regular expression that's checking if the code contains the valid characters that I have here. And I also have another constraint checking that the length of the code is exactly 7. Now, this could also be part of the regular expression, but I wanted to show you how you can chain multiple route constraints inside of the route pattern. And the other endpoints that I have are the list shorten endpoint that's going to just give me back all of the shortened URLs, and also the delete shortened endpoint that allows me to delete a shortened URL from the database based on the identifier. So let me quickly start the application and show you how these endpoints work. So the first endpoint I want to test out is the shorten endpoint, and here I need to specify a long URL that I want to shorten, and I'm going to use something from my website let's take this blog post, for example, that talks about using Amazon SQS and SNS with mass transit. It's a fairly long URL, so that's what I'm going to use. And when I send this URL to my API, I'm going to get a response that contains the shortened URL. Now, if I navigate to this address, I'm going to land in my redirect endpoint that's going to use the unique code that we have here, and is going to fetch the long URL that's associated with this code. Now, if I take a look at the long URL, you will see that it exactly matches the blog post that we are looking for. So I will press continue. And when we open up the browser, you will see that I'm redirected to the original blog post. So this is how the URL shortener works. Now, if I go to the list endpoint here, then we're going to get the list of shortened URLs that I have in the database. So here you can see the code, you can see the long URL, and the formatted short URL that we are using for the redirect. And I also have a delete endpoint that's going to allow me to remove a shortened URL if I want to. So now I want to integrate these 4 endpoints into a functional user interface using Cursor and AI. I'm going to expose this simple application using a local HTTP server. So I'm going to say HTTP server and then specify the port as 3000. And if I execute this, I should see my application if I go to this URL, which you can see if you navigate to this address in the browser, and all we have is hello world. So now we're going to produce all of the code for the user interface using the Cursor IDE. And let me walk you through how this works. You can use the Ctrl-L command to open up the chat. Let's say if I close it down, I press Ctrl-L, it's going to open up the chat. Then I can add additional context in the form of my source code files that Cursor is going to use to produce the code that I want. And how I interact with Cursor is by writing a prompt. So I will give it some instructions into what I'm trying to do, and then we're going to iterate on the results that it gives us back. So I'm going to say we're going to create a UI for a URL shortener. I already have the backend API built and it's running in the background. So I'm giving it some initial context, and then let's tell it to build a simple form that's going to allow us to specify a long URL, send that to our backend, and get back a shortened URL. I'm going to start with the tech stack. I'm going to say we will use HTML and JavaScript. We're going to use Tailwind CSS for stylization, and then let's give it instructions into the actual use case. The first thing I need you to build is a form that allows me to specify a long URL, click a button, send that to my backend to get a shortened URL back, and then expose the result containing the shortened URL. Let's also tell it which endpoint to call. The backend endpoint is localhost 5001 and then shorten, and the response contains the short URL in the JSON body. So this should probably be sufficient to get what we need, and then I'm going to click enter, and Cursor is going to take my initial file and start generating some code that I can use to implement the functionality that I want. Now, what's really interesting here is that, okay, you can walk through the code that is generated, and you can see that it's also creating some JavaScript in the index HTML. It's not what I want. So I'm going to give it another prompt to fix this, but here's how you actually use this. You have this apply button, and you can see what is the file that the code will be applied to. So if I click apply, it's going to take my index.html file and add the code that it generated. And then you can review this like reviewing a diff in a pull request, where you see the code that will be deleted in red and the code that's going to be introduced in green. Then you can review this. Okay, we have some HTML that's using Tailwind CSS. You can see that it imported the Tailwind CSS file from the CDN, which is awesome. Then we have our form here with a button to shorten the URL, and then here is where the result is going to be. And then in this script, it's going to grab some divs using plain JavaScript. It's going to send a fetch request to our backend, sending the long URL, and we expect to get back a response that contains the short URL. So let's go ahead and save this. And you can do that by saying accept. So I'm happy with the prompt. I'm going to save this file, and then let's go into the user interface. So here's what we had before. Now I'm going to refresh this, and now we get a URL shortener form. So I'm going to paste in the long URL to the same blog post that I already had, and I'm going to say shorten. And you can see that we got some sort of error. At this point, you need to do some manual interaction. And the actual problem is that I'm using HTTP here, instead of HTTPS because I specified the HTTPS port. So it can't do everything exactly right unless you give it the correct prompts. For example, I could have specified HTTPS here when I was giving it the original prompt, but nevertheless, I can fix this, refresh my browser, and then specify the long URL again. And now when I shorten it, I get back the shortened URL, and you can see that it's formatted as a link. Let me actually zoom this in so you can see this better. So now if I click the shortened URL, I hit the breakpoint in my backend, so I'm going to remove that. And if I go back to the browser, you will see that it's opening the long URL. So let me show that again. And now you can see that this is actually really functional. So our integration with the post endpoint is working. Now I wanted to first clean up the current source code. So I'm going to give it a prompt to split the script file into my script.js file. So I will add the script.js into my next prompt, and I'm going to tell it, let's extract the JavaScript code into the script.js file. And you can do that by specifying the @ sign and then giving it the name of the file that you are referencing. So this should be enough for it to figure out what I want to do. And then it's going to give you some explanation into what's going to happen. And you can see that it's going to give me a prompt, and you will see that I get the result that's now targeting the script.js file. So let me make this a bit smaller so that we can see more of the code. And I'm going to click apply. And of course, it's going to extract all of the code into this file here. You will see that it's still using HTTP because it's using the previous context. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to say apply. And then we have our script file with the code that was previously in the index.html. But it's also going to tell me that I need to make some adjustments to the index.html. So let's do that. And you can see that it removed all of the JavaScript code and it imported the script file, which is awesome. I'm going to say accept, save this, and now we have a pure HTML file and a JavaScript file containing the functional code. So let's continue working with the JS file. I'm going to tell it that I want the API URL to be configurable, and I'm even going to make a few typos because I don't want to be too careful with what I'm writing. And I also want to say that it should be using HTTPS. So that should be enough of a command. And now it's going to create a configuration object that's going to extract this part of the URL, leaving me only with the endpoint. So let's click apply. And then this is what we get in the source code. So we have a config object, and you can see that it's using some random URL instead of the one that it should be, which isn't ideal. I can either fix this manually or let's give it another prompt. So let's make the root API URL HTTPS localhost 5001 and use that in the config object. So let's give it another prompt, and then I will try applying that. And this time it's looking better, except I also want to omit the shorten part. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that manually. Let's leave it like this. And then in the config part, let's create the URL. And you can see that I even get some auto completions. So I'm going to accept this version, and this should be what I'm looking for. Now I'm going to continue adding onto the existing functionality by telling it to generate a list component that's going to call the get endpoint that we have on the API and render the existing shortened URLs. So let's say now I want you to generate a list component. It will call the shortened endpoint on the API. I'm going to use a sample response in the prompt, and I'm going to say the response of this endpoint is a collection containing this structure. And then let's give it the parts in the JSON response. So I copied this from the Swagger UI, and then let's use this as a prompt. And let's see what we're going to get back. So it's going to generate the new response in the background, and it says it needs to apply some changes to the index.html. So now we have one component for shortening the URL, and then another for populating our list of shortened URLs. So I'm going to accept this suggestion, and then let's see what it's going to suggest in the JavaScript file. And you can see that it's updating the configuration to contain the two endpoints that we have. It's also selecting a new div that's going to contain my list. And then there should be some call here to fetch and display the URLs. Here it is. And this is going to call our endpoint, the list endpoint, and populate the results into the new component. So let's accept this, and then let's see if it's working. So if I refresh the user interface, this is what we get. So let's say I take the same long URL and try to shorten it again. we're going to get the response back, but it's also going to call the backend endpoint and fetch the updated list containing the shortened URLs, which you can see here. So we can continue expanding on this. Let's say I want to be able to delete these individual endpoints. So I'm going to ask it to create an X icon that's going to allow me to delete it. So I will give it another prompt. And you can even start your chat completely from scratch without the previous context. And this should give you a slightly faster response time, but the results may vary. So now I want to say in the shortened URL list component, I want to have an X icon. You can render that as an SVG, and it's going to allow me to delete existing shortened URLs. We're going to call the backend API on this endpoint, and then I will say that the endpoint is delete and then shortened and then specify the ID, and you will use the GUID identifier of the shortened URL that you get back from the list response. So this should probably be enough to generate what I'm looking for. Let's see what it's going to make of it. And it's making an update to the script file, which is this code here, for generating the individual components. So let's click apply. And you can see that now we have some button that we can click, and is going to call the delete URL method, which is going to send a delete request to our backend and attempt to delete the shortened URL. So I'm going to accept these changes. Let's see if there's anything in the HTML file. There isn't. So let's go to the user interface. And now if I refresh this, I should see an X button here. So now if I click this, you can see that the shortened URL disappears, and I suspect that it's deleted, but we can only check if I refresh this, and you can see that it's no longer there. You can continue applying some cosmetic changes. For example, I can say I want to render each shortened URL as a separate box/component, and let's also add a copy button as an icon, and the X icon should be gray instead of red. And this is going to produce some additional functionality on the user interface. Most of the updates will be in the script.js file, so let's apply them. You can see the updates here with the additional copy to clipboard functionality. And let me check the rest of the file. There aren't any significant changes, so let's accept that. And then there aren't any changes in the index.html, as I suspect. And if I go ahead and refresh the user interface, here's what we get. So now this component is nicely grayed out, but it's in this larger component and I don't necessarily like that. So I'm going to tell it to get rid of this and just leave the box here that contains the shortened URL. So let me type all of the new prompts from a new chat so that you can better see the prompt. And I'm going to tell it to leave out the parent container for the shortened URLs, and let's render the individual URLs as self-contained elements on the user interface. So this should probably be sufficient. Then it's going to make an update to the script.js file. I can apply these changes when it's done. So it's probably still generating the files. Okay, now it's making the updates. So here they are. I can go ahead and review the updates, figure out if this is what I need. And if I'm happy with the updates, I can say accept. Then it probably needs to make an update to the index.html file, but it doesn't seem there is. Let's see if this is applied, the update to the display URLs. And it looks like everything is fine. Oh, it wasn't. There were some missing updates here, or it could be my formatting rules. So now with these changes saved, let's check the user interface again. And if I refresh the UI, you can see that it didn't really get what I was trying to do. So let me try to give it another prompt that I want to get rid of this element, or I could do it myself, but it's more interesting to make the AI figure it out. So I'm going to say, it seems like you didn't understand me. I want to get rid of the container with, and I'll just paste the text that was inside of that element. So hopefully it will be able to figure it out. And then let's see if it made the required updates. So there are some updates here and a few updates here. So hopefully this should do it. Let's see what we get in the response. So if I refresh the page, now it's continuing to make a mess of it. So you can see that it's not almighty, but an interesting thing that I found you can do is to actually make a screenshot. So let's test it out. I'm going to make a screenshot, and then I'm going to use the screenshot as additional context for the prompt. So let's start with a new prompt. I'm also going to add the index.html file, and I will paste in the image, which you can see here, and then I'm going to explain what the problem is. So I'll say now the shortened URL spans the width of the page, which isn't what I wanted. It should follow the same width of the other containers, and the element containing the shortened URLs, or rather URL components, doesn't need to have a title or a background. So I'm hoping this is going to nudge it in the right direction. But as I said, at any point, you can go ahead and just update the code yourself if you know what you are doing. But I'm doing this mainly to showcase that you can do some interesting things by just using AI. So now it hopefully figured it out. It updated the index.html. We only have a container here that's going to contain the individual URLs, and it's also going to need to make some updates in the display URLs function. So let's accept the suggested changes. And now if I refresh the user interface, I finally get what I was looking for. So let me add a few more URLs. Let's add them here. And now we have a fully functional user interface. You can see when the shortened URL was created, what was the original URL. You can click on the shortened URL. You have a copy function here to copy it into the clipboard. And you can also delete this if you don't want to use it anymore. So this is great. Now I want to expand on this functionality a bit more by adding some optional parameters that I can add to the long URL. So let's create another prompt. I'm going to include the index.html and the script file as part of my context, and I'm going to tell it to generate a form that will allow me to specify optional UTM parameters in the long URL. So let's see if this is enough context for it to figure out what I'm trying to do, and it's going to go ahead and generate the code that I want. So it needs to make some updates in the index.html file, and these are going to contain the UTM parameters like source, medium, campaign, term, and content that I want to be able to optionally append to the long URL. So I will accept these changes, and then it's going to make an update to the JavaScript file to append these values if they are specified in the form. So let's accept the changes. And then let's go to the user interface, and I have to update the UI, and you can see these values here. So now I should be able to take the long URL value here, and let's specify a source. Let's say YouTube, let's say the medium is social, and let's say I want to shorten this. And you can see that the original URL now contains the UTM links. Now they aren't really formatted in the ideal format. There should be an underscore here, but this is something that you can fix with an additional prompt. And one more thing that I want to show you that's absolutely awesome, and I think that every user interface needs, is dark mode. So I'm going to start a new chat, and I'm just going to say, let's add support for dark mode. And it's going to use the functionality that Tailwind CSS has, which is easy support for dark mode using utility classes. So it's going to make an update to my index.html file. It's going to create a configuration object containing the current mode, which is going to be either dark or light mode. And then it's going to add a toggle button so that I can switch between light mode and dark mode. So let's accept these changes. And then it's going to add the functionality to the toggle button in the script.js file. So let's accept these changes as well. And then let's check out the user interface. If I refresh the UI, here is my dark mode button. And if I click, you can see that we have completely functional dark and light mode switch. So now I can continue to tweak this to make the button change the color a little. I could make this form with the UTM parameters completely optional so that I can expand it or collapse it on demand. But essentially you can get to a very functional user interface really quickly using the Cursor IDE and the power of AI. A couple of more things that I wanted to mention is the setup that I'm using for Cursor. And this is just the default setup with privacy mode turned on. From the chat window here, you can see what are the available AI models, and I configured it to just use Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which is the recommended model for writing code. Now, if you go into the configuration, you get to choose additional options, and from the models tab here, you can choose which AI models you want to use. So there's GPT-4, GPT-4o, Claude 3 Opus, Cursor Small, which is their AI model, but I just configured it to use Claude 3.5 Sonnet. If you have an API key for OpenAPI for the Anthropic API, which is the company behind Claude, then you can specify the API key and use that to generate the responses, and that's going to be a pay-as-you-go pricing model, or you can use the Cursor Pro subscription and pay a fixed price per month. Now, when it comes to features, you can also configure a bunch of things here. I'm not going to dive into the fine details, and since Cursor is still in development, there are some beta features that you can optionally turn on. One feature that I'm excited for, which isn't currently available in the user interface, although it was there yesterday, was the Cursor Composer that allows you to specify a large number of files and then use that to generate additional code. So overall, I hope this was a good introduction into using Cursor to write some code. You can see the code that it produces isn't all that bad. It's making a mistake here and there, but from a functional perspective, this code does what we want it to do. You could tell it to refactor this code into additional components if you want to split this up between multiple files. It also works pretty well with front-end frameworks like React or Angular or Next.js. I tested it out a little bit with Blazor, but I didn't have time to do a deep dive, so I opted to use JavaScript because I know that it would have been functional for this video. I really like the chat capability that you have built in to the IDE, and it would be awesome if we had something similar in Visual Studio. Now imagine writing .NET with a sidebar chat that allows you to specify a piece of code and then use AI to tell it what you want to build next. There are both good and bad sides to this. The good side is that the barrier to entry into writing code is very low. Also, if you're an experienced developer, you can get to something functional incredibly quickly using the power of AI. Now, the one drawback that I see with this is people are going to start lacking fundamentals of software engineering if they rely on AI too much to write the code for them. So let's see what the future will bring, but I'm definitely excited about using AI more and more as part of my development process. Let me know in the comments what you think about using Cursor and AI to write code for you. Also, if you want to see more videos like this one in the future, then go ahead and click the like button under this video. Check out my clean architecture and modular monolith courses to improve your skills, and until next time, stay awesome.